Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. Forest Phantom. Disappearance into the darkness. The forest that stretched along the edge of the small town of Deglora was known not only for its beauty but also for its dark legends. The local elders warned the youth about a phantom that wandered in the depths of the forest. You'll follow it, and you won't return, they would say, lighting old lamps on their verandas. But nothing could stop the young people from exploring the forest. A warm night under the fog became the perfect time for an expedition. Emily and her friends ventured deep into the forest, enchanted not only by the beauty of nature but also by the chance to test the ancient myths. At first, the night was peaceful. The leaves rustled underfoot, and the air was rich with the scent of the pine forest. But the deeper they went, the more they felt that something was wrong. At first, they heard a barely noticeable rustle, but with every step, the sound grew, as if something invisible was watching them. "Do you hear that?" Jason, one of the friends, asked, casting a glance into the darkness. Emily, though feeling some fear, did not want to show it. She pressed on, determined. "It's just the wind," she said, trying to calm everyone down. But the forest seemed alive. It could change its contours, giving trees and stones strange shapes, as if it weren't nature, but a huge sinister creature waiting to engulf anyone who ventured too deep. But they didn't stop. At some point, they all stopped at once. The rustling of the leaves ceased, and the air suddenly turned cold. They began to look around, as if expecting something to leap out of the darkness. "Let's go back," Jane said, her voice a little hoarse, like someone who felt real fear. But they didn't have time to turn back. Suddenly, the light of their lantern began to dim. Shadows began to move, though there was no wind, and each of them felt their hearts beat faster. The sense that they were being watched grew stronger. Then, suddenly, a figure appeared from the dense part of the forest. A tall, indistinct shape without a face. It moved like a shadow, growing closer to the group. One of the friends screamed, but the voice was lost in the emptiness. Something terrifying had happened. They tried to head back to their cars, but with each step, it seemed they were moving farther from the path. The trails blurred, the trees grew more similar to each other, and time lost all meaning. They all felt trapped. Meanwhile, each of them began to see ghostly images in the darkness, faces of people who had long disappeared, dead eyes watching them from behind every tree. They heard voices of their friends, but when they turned around, they were gone. If you like this beginning, I can continue the story or further develop the events. The darkness grew denser, and with every step they took, the situation only worsened. The lanterns shook in their hands, emitting weak light that couldn't penetrate the gloom. The grass rustled beneath their feet, but every sound seemed to change, echoing with barely audible whispers. The forest felt alive. It seemed to be watching them closely. Jason was the first to break. He dropped his lantern and ran into the darkness. "We have to go. This isn't right," he shouted, without looking back. Emily shouted after him, but he was already gone, swallowed by the dense forest's darkness. They wanted to run after him, but something held them back. The forest was foreign, hostile, and every move felt like a mistake. Then, suddenly, a silent stillness descended. Only their hearts beat in their chests, loudly like drums at a festival, the further they went. The lanterns no longer gave off light, and all sounds disappeared, leaving only the feeling of something cold and terrifying following them. And then, the figure appeared again. Tall, unnaturally thin, its feet didn't touch the ground. It floated through the forest like a ghost, dissolving into the fog. There was no face, only a dark abyss that swallowed the light. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice was low, cold, as though the forest itself was speaking. Emily, holding the last lantern, stood in confusion. Her mind began to spiral into guesses, but fear was stronger than any doubt. This was no mere phantom. This was a being that lived in the forest, and anyone who ventured this far became part of it. Jane, who stood nearby, suddenly began to scream. Her hands trembled. She tried to close her eyes, but invisible fingers were pulling her toward it. One more moment, and she vanished, as though swallowed by the darkness itself. "Jane!" Emily shouted. They rushed toward the place where she had just stood, but couldn't find her. The forest had swallowed her, and now only her faint shadow remained in the thick undergrowth. Suddenly, something else appeared on the horizon. A distant flicker, moving back and forth as if searching for a way. But as they approached the light, it retreated. Their legs were heavy, pushing them backward, even though they weren't moving. The forest acted like a magnet, pulling them farther away from any hope of salvation. Meanwhile, the figure reappeared, and now the voice was not just in their heads. It filled the forest, becoming so loud that they could feel the earth beneath their feet pulse. You came here, and now you won't return. The forest will take you, as it has taken others. Emily felt her strength leave her. She stared at the dark figure, but couldn't look away. More and more, she felt her consciousness slipping into the darkness, becoming part of the forest, part of the phantom that roamed its paths. But suddenly, she heard him. Jason. His scream echoed in her head, as if from another world. Help! He cried. Emily rushed toward the sound, forgetting everything. Only the fog and shadows around her. After that, she didn't remember how she ended up in this part of the forest, the part where no one ever returned. When dawn finally broke through the trees, the locals found empty cars by the edge of the forest. Many years had passed since they last heard of disappearances. No one could explain what happened to those who entered the forest that night. The legend of the forest phantom came alive again. People often went around it, for who knows, maybe it's still waiting for its new victims today. But no one will ever know what happened to Emily, Jason, and Jane, because the forest takes them. And they remain in it forever. Emily couldn't remember how much time had passed. Darkness wrapped around her like a blanket, and she found herself standing in the same spot in the forest where everything had begun. There was nothing around her except the deep darkness that mercilessly consumed everything in its path. She felt her heart begin to race again, as the cold, damp air seemed even heavier than before. The forest was no longer the same. It was now a place that took not only people's bodies but their souls as well. All sounds and colors mixed into one large black tangle, and only fear remained real. Emily took a few steps forward, her feet feeling every inch of this terrifying place. The leaves beneath her seemed alive, rustling like a muffled whisper. She looked around but saw nothing, only the blurred outlines of trees and emptiness around her. Her mind was filled with only one thought: find her friends, find Jason and Jane, and get out of this hell. And suddenly, she heard them again. First, Jason's faint voice, then Jane's voice. They sounded as if they were right behind her, but when she turned, she saw no one. Emily, help us! Their cries echoed in her mind. The feeling that something was approaching again wouldn't let her rest. She hurried toward the sounds, which grew clearer, closer, but the deeper she ventured into the forest, the more their voices became distorted. They turned into sounds that couldn't be understood. Soft cries, incomprehensible whispers. The forest consumed them, and it wouldn't let her go any further. Then, unexpectedly, she saw it. An old, twisted figure standing among the trees. Her hair was loose, and her eyes were empty black windows. A cold air emanated from her, burning Emily's skin. You can't get out of here, she said with an indescribable shadow in her voice, and those words resonated in every corner of Emily's mind. Emily felt her body freeze, unable to move. The forest was no longer just a place, it was a trap from which there was no escape. Every path led back to the same spot. No matter where she went, it all came back to the beginning. Why? Why are you keeping us here? Her voice sounded merciless, but her body was ready to dissolve completely into the darkness. You don't understand. The forest takes everyone who mocks its shadows. And you've become a part of it. Now you're with us. And you'll never return. Emily felt the cold, foul air fill her lungs. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the very shadow of the forest. The trees around her began to stir, creating twisted faces from themselves, as if the forest itself was becoming part of her own nightmare. All these faces stared at her, silently, but she could feel their endless suffering. Some of these faces were familiar. They were the faces of her friends. Jason and Jane, they were there, in that darkness, now without bodies, only their souls wandering among the trees, restless. And this was only the beginning of what the forest would do to her. And then, like a lightning bolt in the dark sky, everything became even worse. They were here. Those taken by the forest many years ago appeared. And they had become part of this forest, ghosts unnoticed by anyone, and whom no one could rid themselves of. Everyone who entered here stayed. And with every new disappearance, the forest grew stronger, extending its black roots into the ground. And no one returned. Because the forest takes you forever. Emily felt her feet being pulled back to the earth. Her body no longer belonged to her. She was a part of this world, a part of the forest. And her screams were drowned out by the wind, which carried them through the branches and forever disappeared into the darkness. After everything had quieted down, the locals declared the forest a cursed place. Many of them knew the dark legends, but no one dared investigate the disappearances of young people. The forest seemed to live its own life, and on the night you ventured into its depths, you would never leave. And although time passed and the legends became weaker, some still heard the night cries and strange sounds that appeared when the night was at its darkest. The forest ghost was not gone, and everything that appeared within its bounds became a part of it. Forever. Several months passed, and it seemed that the town had slowly forgotten about the missing people. People tried to return to their normal lives, but nothing could erase the memory of what happened that terrible night. Conversations about the forest ghost became rarer, but some still heard strange whispers when passing near the forest's edge. Some even claimed to have seen people deep in the woods. They stood nearby like shadows, watching the path as if waiting for someone. But one evening, after the autumn rain had turned the forest into a damp and gloomy place, the thing everyone had feared happened. A young man named Thomas, a local teenager, didn't believe the terrifying tales. He thought of them as just old stories passed down through generations. The forest is just a forest, he thought, laughing at those who trembled with fear. Thomas knew all the paths in the forest and often wandered there, ignoring the mythical dangers. One evening, he decided to walk the entire distance from the town to an old house deep in the woods. He had heard of this place since childhood, an old house, abandoned many years ago, but in truth, it was the place where a family had once died. They had all disappeared and never returned. "It's just stories," Thomas repeated as he entered the forest. As always, the forest was quiet, with only the dry grass rustling underfoot. But the further he went, the more he felt that something was wrong. The shadows grew longer, the trees looked strange. And though the rain had stopped, the damp air wrapped around him like a living, unfamiliar creature. Deep in the forest, he noticed the first sign. It was a figure standing on the path. Tall, hunched, with a faceless face framed by heavy dark hair that dragged on the ground. Thomas immediately felt his heart tighten, but he tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. He walked past without stopping. But his next step wasn't as confident. The figure appeared again, and this time he saw its face. Empty black eyes staring straight into his soul. He froze, unable to move. "Are you looking for death?" he heard, and the voice sounded like an echo of distant pain, as if the forest itself was speaking to him. Thomas wanted to respond, but couldn't. His tongue was tied, his hands and feet were like trees rooted to the ground. And only one clear feeling remained. He had become a part of this nightmare. In the darkness of the forest, another figure appeared. And again, they were people, walking slowly, showing clear signs that their bodies had long been claimed by the twilight of this world. They didn't speak, but their eyes were fixed on Thomas, like a new victim, a new addition to their death. With each step, his heart beat faster. And suddenly, like a menacing air storm, the forest came alive. The shadows began to move, the trees creaked, and around his figure, a burning misty veil flared up. In that moment, he understood that the forest hadn't swallowed him by accident. Thomas tried to run, but his legs no longer obeyed him. He felt something cold and heavy wrapping around his body. He was no longer himself. He had become part of the forest, one of those shadows that can still move, but can never leave this dreadful world. He heard his voice, but it wasn't his own. It was Jason's voice, and Jane's, and all the others who had died here. They were all part of the forest now, and the forest was still waiting. Thomas had become their reflection, their ghost. Meanwhile, no one in the town noticed his disappearance. The forest did not wish to leave witnesses. So, even if someone were to search for him, he would remain forever forgotten, lost among the dark trees, where the light no longer shines, and where even time has no meaning. Now the forest waits again. It waits for the next one who dares to cross the line where its voices blend with the voices of previous victims. And when the next night falls on these lands, it will bring another soul to add to their great dark kingdom. No one will return. The dark night that followed the rain once again enveloped the forest. The silence was deafening, as if the entire world had fallen still, watching what was happening deep within this dreadful place. The forest was not just a forest, it was a trap for souls that time and again found themselves in its dark embrace. And the forest ghost could not allow anyone who dared to cross its boundaries to escape. One by one, new victims appeared. Maikaita and Irina, a couple who decided to take a walk to reach the old cottage to the west of the forest, did not know what awaited them. They laughed, mocking the ghostly legends, even lighting a fire as they discussed terrifying stories. They thought all these tales were nothing more than inventions to scare children. But when night fell into shadow, the forest spoke. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and something incredibly cold began to stir in the forest. The leaves on the trees rustled as though something was pulling them underground. The lanterns hanging by the fire began to tremble and then went out completely. Irina grew frightened when she heard strange sounds, rustling that resembled footsteps, followed by quiet moans that seemed to come from all sides. "Maikaita! Do you hear that?" Irina's voice trembled, but Maikaita, laughing, only joked, "It's just the wind or a night creature. Don't worry, we're fine." But that's when it appeared. A tall figure, emerging from the darkness, was so terrifying that even Maikaita stopped, feeling his heart race with fear. Its eyes were black like the depths of the abyss, and its body was not made of human flesh but seemed to be composed of decaying wood covered in moss and mold. Its hair fluttered in the air, as if its very life was intertwined with every branch. The ghost did not move, but its presence filled everything. It was there, in front of them, and they couldn't move. Irina cried out in terror, unable to understand whether it was truly something alive or just a phantom shadow. She ran toward Maikaita, but she could no longer find him. He vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, as if swallowed by the forest itself. Irina looked around. She could no longer hear his voice. She began to scream, but her words died in the air. The forest swallowed her cry, and all that remained was the cold, merciless breath of the night. Suddenly, something flew by her quickly. For a moment, Irina saw a dark shadow moving so swiftly that it was indistinguishable from the trees themselves. And her neck ached, as though something heavy was tightening around it. She fell to the ground, and before her appeared that face again, featureless but with enormous black eyes. "You've gone too deep," the ghost whispered, and its voice carried despair and death. Irina could no longer speak a word, her eyes closed, but before she disappeared into the darkness, she saw her own body becoming part of the forest. She felt her soul detach from her flesh and get drawn into an emptiness where there was neither space nor time. Meanwhile, Maikaita appeared again. But this was no longer the same Maikaita. His body stood before the forest ghost, but his eyes were empty, and his skin was gray, crumbling. He stood like a shadow, like one of those who had become part of this forest, forgetting his name and his life. He had become a part of these black trees, and the forest began to consume them again. One by one, the victims became part of its dark branches, faceless, dead. And when the next night came, everything repeated itself. The local people began to notice that every time the night grew dark and deep, new sounds came from the forest: cracks, screams, moans. But these were not sounds heard from a distance. These were sounds that came from the very heart of the forest. And people feared that someone else had vanished. They already knew, the forest ghost leaves nothing behind. It returns people to itself, takes them, and never lets them go. No one laughed at those terrifying stories anymore. The forest does not forgive. Those who went too deep had become part of it. Forever. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows. They are always near. Until next time.